The morning light spilled through the boardroom windows like a cold confession, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany table where my sister sat, her posture perfect, her smile practiced. The separation agreement waited between us, crisp and white against the darkwood grain. 25 years of my life distilled into 14 pages of corporate legalese. I remember how the pen felt in my hand, heavier than it should have been, as Jenna spoke those words that still echo in the hollow spaces of my chest. "It's time for a new direction, Eli. You've done enough." There was no malice in her voice, and somehow that made it worse. Just the cool efficiency of someone closing a chapter they no longer needed. I signed my name where the yellow tabs indicated, each stroke of ink severing another thread that had bound me to Northridge Textiles since I was 26 years old. I didn't argue. What would have been the point? The decision had been made in boardrooms I no longer had access to, in conversations to which I hadn't been invited. So I stood, buttoned my jacket, the same navy wool I'd worn to our father's funeral, and walked out through the glass lobby I had designed a decade earlier. The interns didn't look up from their screens. The executives kept their eyes fixed on their phones. No one said goodbye to the man who had kept their paychecks coming through 2 recessions and a pandemic. I was already a ghost. I remember pausing at the glass doors, my hand on the brushed steel handle, feeling the weight of all those years pressing down on my shoulders. For a moment, I considered turning back, not to plead or argue, but simply to look once more at the space I had shaped with my own hands and heart. The Italian marble flooring that had replaced the scuffed linoleum of my father's day. The recessed lighting I'd insisted on during the renovation, soft and flattering where the old fluorescents had been harsh. The custom display cases showcasing our finest fabrics, arranged by season and texture rather than price point. My idea, against the consultant's recommendation. But I didn't turn. Pride, perhaps, or the sudden knowledge that memory would preserve these details more faithfully than a final glance ever could. So I pushed through those doors and stepped out into the morning, feeling like an exile from a country I had helped to build. The wind outside had teeth that day, biting through my coat as I walked to my car. 51 years old and suddenly untethered from the only real purpose I'd ever known. I sat behind the wheel for a long time, watching employees come and go through the front entrance. Our logo, the overlapping N and T that I'd sketched on a napkin years ago, gleaming in brushed aluminum above the doors. I thought about the early days when the building was just a leaking warehouse on the edge of town, and our father's fabric wholesale business was 3 months from bankruptcy. I was fresh out of college then, with a business degree and the stubborn belief that our family name could mean something again. Dad had built the company on handshakes and quality goods, but he'd resisted change until it was almost too late. The internet was reshaping retail, and our ledger books and paper catalogs were anchors dragging us down. I remember the night I convinced him to let me try something new, an online catalog, digital inventory, direct shipments to designers instead of just storefronts. He looked at me across his cluttered desk, his eyes tired but still sharp. "You always were like your mother," he'd said. "Never could leave well enough alone." It wasn't quite permission, but it was enough. The parking lot had filled since my arrival that morning. I recognized most of the vehicles. Sarah from accounting drove the blue Honda with a dented fender. Miguel in shipping had the red pickup with the veteran sticker in the window. Marissa, our head of design, parked her vintage Volkswagen Beetle in the same spot every day, rain or shine. These were not just employees to me. They were extensions of a family I had cultivated with the same care I now gave to my garden. I wondered if Jenna knew their stories. How Miguel had worked through chemotherapy 3 years ago, never missing a day. How Sarah's daughter had just been accepted to Stanford on a partial scholarship. How Marissa had turned down offers from larger companies because she believed in what we were building at Northridge. These were the invisible threads that bound our company together, stronger than any corporate structure or quarterly report. I wondered how many would snap in the months to come. Starting the car, I caught a glimpse of myself in the rearview mirror. The silver in my temples that hadn't been there when I'd started, the lines around my eyes that deepened when I smiled. My father's face looking back at me, weathered by the same worries, the same pride. I pulled away from the curb without a backward glance. Some endings are better faced looking forward. Those first few years blur together in my memory. Endless hours hunched over spreadsheets, cold calling potential clients, learning logistics from the ground up. I rebuilt our supplier network piece by piece, focusing on reliability over cost. When the bank wouldn't extend our line of credit, I mortgaged my small house to make payroll. Twice. There were nights I slept on the office couch, too exhausted to drive home, waking to the sound of the early shift arriving. Slowly, painfully, we clawed our way back to solvency, then to stability, and finally to growth. I still remember our first $1 million quarter, not for the number itself, but for the way my father's hands trembled when I showed him the books. "You did this," he said, and for once, there was no qualification in his voice. Just pride. He died 6 months later, his heart giving out while he slept. The company became mine in name as well as practice, though I never took the CEO title. I was content to be listed as managing director. Titles were for business cards and door plaques. I prefer to be measured by results. Jenna joined the company 15 years ago, fresh from business school with her MBA and a confidence I both admired and envied. She was bright, ambitious, and carried our mother's charm, something I had always lacked. Where I was methodical, she was intuitive. Where I built slowly, she saw shortcuts. She understood social media and digital marketing in ways I never could, and under her guidance, our brand recognition soared. We made a good team, I thought. My systems and her vision. My stability and her innovation. When she suggested taking the company public 5 years ago, I resisted. We argued for weeks, the only real fight we'd ever had as adults. In the end, I convinced her that private ownership let us prioritize quality and relationships over quarterly profits. She conceded, but something shifted between us after that. A subtle cooling I attributed to professional disappointment. I should have seen it for what it was, the first frost before winter. Now, sitting in my car outside the building I had helped design, watching employees I had hired walk through doors I had chosen, I finally understood what had happened. I hadn't just lost my job. I had lost my legacy. The house felt emptier than usual when I returned home that afternoon. The silence had weight to it, pressing against my ears as I moved through rooms that suddenly seemed too large. I poured myself 2 fingers of the scotch I kept for special occasions. 18-year Macallan that had been a gift from our largest client when we hit $5 million in annual revenue. The burn felt right, like punishment for my blindness. I had been so focused on the business that I hadn't seen the ambition growing in my sister, hadn't recognized that my mentorship was laying the groundwork for my own obsolescence. That night, I sat in my study until dawn, surrounded by the photographs and mementos of a career that had defined me for so long. There's the first dollar we'd earned through our online portal, framed and hanging next to my business degree. The industry award for supply chain innovation we'd received during the pandemic. The thank you cards from employees whose medical bills we'd covered, whose children's educations we'd helped fund. I had never needed applause or recognition. I had only wanted to build something that would outlast me, something worthy of our Father's name. Now all I had were the artifacts of a life that no longer belonged to me. Morning came, gray and featureless, the sun hiding behind clouds that promised rain. I showered, shaved, dressed in jeans and a sweater instead of my usual suit. There was a strange freedom in having nowhere to be, no one waiting for my decisions or approval. I made coffee and carried it out to the small greenhouse attached to the back of my house, a space I had built years ago but rarely used. Inside, the air was warm and thick with the scent of soil and green things. My father had taught me to garden when I was a boy, his rough hands guiding mine as we pressed seeds into dirt. "Plants don't care about your college degree," he used to say. "They only care if you pay attention." I had forgotten that lesson somewhere along the way, too caught up in spreadsheets and growth projections to notice the seasons changing. Now, with empty hours stretching before me, I began to clean the neglected space, sweeping away dead leaves and spider webs, organizing the abandoned tools and empty pots. It was simple work, physical and immediate, By midday, my hands were dirty and my back ached, but the greenhouse gleamed with potential. I drove to the local nursery and spent too much money on seedlings and soil amendments, fertilizer and new gloves. The woman at the register recognized me, not as Eli Northridge of Northridge Textiles, but as the man who bought the Thompson place on Oak Street. It was strange to be known for something so ordinary, but not unpleasant. Days passed, then weeks. I established a new routine centered around my greenhouse and garden. I planted heirloom tomatoes and peppers, herbs and flowers. I built raised beds and installed an irrigation system. I read books about companion planting and composting, soil chemistry, and natural pest control. When my phone rang with calls from former colleagues or clients, I let them go to voicemail. Not out of bitterness, but because I wasn't ready to be that person again, the problem solver, the steady hand, the one with the answers. Instead, I learned to be still, to watch the slow unfurling of leaves and the gradual ripening of fruit. Time moved differently here, measured in growth rather than quarters, in seasons rather than fiscal years. 3 months after my dismissal, I received my first communication from Northridge Textiles, an impersonal email announcing exciting changes and streamlined operations. Reading between the lines, I understood that Jenna was making her mark, reshaping the company in her image. New consultants have been brought in. Automation was being implemented. The overseas supplier network I had carefully cultivated was being reevaluated for efficiency and contemporary relevance. I deleted the email without responding. It wasn't my company anymore. The first call came a week later. Luis Mendez, our former head of logistics, his voice tight with controlled anger. "They're getting everything we built, Eli. The new systems don't work with our inventory tracking. Orders are getting lost. The warehouse staff is down to half strength, and the new kids don't know the stock. Jenna's blaming you now, saying the foundation was weak, that we were operating on outdated models." I listened without interrupting, feeling a complicated mix of vindication and grief. When he finished, I asked about his family, his son who had been starting college when I left. We talked about normal things, weather and baseball, the restaurant downtown that had closed after 30 years. I didn't offer advice or criticism. When he asked if I would consider talking to Jenna, I declined gently. "That chapter's closed, Luis. For both of us." After we hung up, I sat in my garden watching bees move methodically from flower to flower, their purpose clear and uncomplicated. There was wisdom in their single-mindedness, their devotion to work that served the whole. I had tried to build Northridge Textiles on similar principles. Everyone's role essential, everyone's contribution valued. Now those principles were being dismantled one by one, replaced by sleeker, colder efficiencies. I should have felt anger, but all I felt was a dull ache, like an old injury in changing weather. The emails and calls increased as summer gave way to fall. A message from Evelyn Sean at Pattern House, one of our oldest clients. "We'd come back if you were still there." A text from Marco in accounting. "Q3 numbers are bad. Really bad." A voicemail from our bank representative, his tone carefully neutral. "Just checking in, Eli. Hoping we could talk soon." I let them accumulate, a digital chorus of concern and confusion. Each one was a small confirmation that the systems I had built were not as easily replaced as Jenna had imagined. But I didn't feel satisfaction, only a weary sadness. This wasn't what I wanted. I had hoped she would succeed, would take what I had built and make it better. Instead, she was learning the hardest lesson of business, that relationships matter more than innovation, that trust takes years to build and moments to destroy. At night, I dreamed of the warehouse, the familiar smells of cardboard and fabric, the rhythmic beep of scanners, the hum of conversation. In my dreams, I walked through aisles of inventory, touching bolts of cloth like old friends. I knew where everything belonged. I knew its purpose and its value. Then I would wake to the pre-dawn darkness of my bedroom, momentarily disoriented, reaching for a phone that no longer rang with urgent problems to solve. 9 months after I signed the separation agreement, Jenna appeared at my front door. It was a Sunday morning, the air crisp with the promise of winter. I was in the greenhouse when the doorbell rang, and I almost didn't answer. But some habits die hard, and the sense of obligation that had driven me for decades propelled me through the house. She stood on the porch, smaller somehow than I remembered, her designer coat buttoned against the cold. No camera crew, no board members, no entourage. Just my sister, her face drawn with exhaustion and something that might have been fear. "Can I come in?" she asked, and her voice lacked the polished confidence I had heard in the boardroom. Inside, she sat at my kitchen table, declining coffee, her gaze moving around the room as if searching for something familiar. "You've been gardening," she said, nodding toward my dirt-stained jeans and the fresh herbs hanging to dry by the window. It wasn't a question, so I didn't answer. The silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken accusations and apologies. Finally, she spoke the words I had been expecting for months. "We need you back, Eli." Fitzgerald Mills had walked. Our biggest contract, 20% of annual revenue. The new inventory software had failed during implementation, corrupting data that would take months to reconstruct. 3 key suppliers had shifted their best stock to competitors after payment delays. They were bleeding money. Her word, not mine. Bleeding. As if the company were a living thing, which in many ways it was. I watched her as she spoke, this woman who shared my blood but had become a stranger. Her hands fidgeted with her wedding ring, a nervous habit she'd had since childhood. Her nails, usually manicured to perfection, showed chips in the polish. There were shadows beneath her eyes that makeup couldn't quite conceal. For a moment, I saw the 8-year-old girl who used to follow me around our father's warehouse, climbing on rolls of fabric like they were mountains to be conquered, asking endless questions about where things came from and how they worked. I remembered teaching her to use the old cash register, lifting her onto a stool so she could reach the keys. I remembered her graduation from business school, how proudly she had introduced me to her professors. "This is my brother, Eli. He taught me everything I know about business." The memory stung like salt in a wound I thought had begun to heal. In the silence that followed her plea, I could hear the steady drip of melting snow from the eaves, the distant hum of the furnace, the soft tick of the kitchen clock that had belonged to our grandmother. Time passing, unmoved by human drama. I poured myself a glass of water, noting how the winter light caught in it, fracturing into tiny rainbows on the wooden tabletop. Such small beauties I had missed in my years of boardrooms and balance sheets. "Tell me everything," I said finally, not in agreement, but in a desire to understand. And she did. The cascade of problems that had followed my departure, each decision leading to new complications, the increasing pressure from the board, the sleepless nights. As she spoke, I recognized the weight she carried, the same weight I had shouldered for decades, but without the foundation of experience to distribute it evenly. Despite everything, a part of me wanted to help her, to lift that burden as I had done so many times before. But another part knew that some lessons can only be learned through consequence. She offered me a consulting role. No title, no public acknowledgement, just a chance to work behind the scenes to stabilize the situation. Her hands twisted in her lap as she spoke, her wedding ring catching the light. I remembered when she got engaged, how she had called me first before even telling her mother. I remembered walking her down the aisle after our father died, the weight of her hand on my arm, the trust in that simple touch. Now she couldn't meet my eyes as she outlined the terms of my return: generous compensation, flexible hours, complete operational authority. Everything except what mattered. My name on the door again. "The business I loved doesn't exist anymore," I said finally, my voice steady. "You've changed too much to go back." Her face flushed, anger momentarily overtaking desperation. "You don't understand modern markets, Eli. We had to evolve. Dad's old-fashioned methods." I cut her off, not with heat, but with quiet certainty. Dad understood that business is about people, not just products. So did I. That was never old-fashioned. That was wisdom. She left an hour later, the consulting contract and signed on my table. Through the window, I watched her sit in her car for a long time before driving away, her phone pressed to her ear, already moving to the next solution, the next quick fix. I returned to my greenhouse, to the slow, patient work of cultivation. That evening, I registered a new business name, Northridge Supply. Not textiles, not fashion, just supply. Reliable, consistent, built on trust rather than trends. Starting over at 52 wasn't what I had planned, but there was unexpected joy in the simplicity of beginning again. I leased a small warehouse on the outskirts of town. Nothing fancy, just clean concrete and good lighting. I called Luis first, then Marco, then the handful of others who had reached out over the months. Not all of them came. Some had found other jobs, some had relocated, but enough returned to form the core of something new. We started small, focusing on the clients and suppliers that Jenna had deemed too traditional or too demanding. I took no salary the first year, living off my savings and the modest severance package. Every decision was deliberate, every expansion carefully considered. We built our reputation on the foundations I had always valued: reliability, transparency, personal attention. No automation without purpose. No growth without stability. No promises we couldn't keep. Word spread slowly through the industry. Eli Northridge was back, not with flash, but with substance. Orders trickled in, then flowed steadily. Former clients returned, bringing new ones with them. Suppliers offered preferential terms based on relationships that had weathered decades. We weren't trying to compete with Northridge Textiles directly. Their market had shifted under Jenna's direction, focusing on trendier, more volatile segments. We occupied the space they had abandoned, serving clients who valued consistency over cutting edge. It wasn't about revenge or vindication. It was about honoring what I had always believed in. The truth about Jenna's motives emerged a year after my dismissal, not through gossip or speculation, but through official channels. A former board member leaked documents to an industry publication, emails and meeting minutes that painted a clear picture of the plan that had been set in motion months before I was asked to leave. Jenna had been in talks with a private equity firm, positioning Northridge Textiles for acquisition. My presence had been an obstacle, too tied to the old ways, too resistant to the changes that would make the company attractive to buyers. The modernization narrative had been crafted not for growth, but for sale, a way to justify dismantling systems that prioritized long-term stability over short-term profits. But when the numbers soured after my departure, when clients began to leave and suppliers became unreliable, the buyers pulled out. The article was titled "The $10 million Fabric Empire That Lost Its Thread." It quoted anonymous employees and clients, detailed the financial decline, and ended with a small mention of my new venture, a return of fundamentals in an industry increasingly driven by algorithms rather than relationships. I didn't comment when the reporter called. I didn't need to. The story told itself. 2 years have passed since that morning in the boardroom. Northridge Supply now operates out of a modestly expanded warehouse with 32 employees, less than half the staff of the original company at its peak, but with triple the trust in the industry. We're profitable, stable, growing at a pace that feels right rather than rushed. In the break room hangs a framed invoice. Our first order from Fitzgerald Mills after they left Northridge Textiles. Not our largest client anymore, but symbolically important. On the wall of my simple office, there's a photograph of my father standing in front of the original warehouse, his expression serious, but his eyes bright with possibility. Next to it hangs a painting my mother made before she died, a landscape of rolling hills and distant mountains, the perspective wide and generous. These are my touchstones, reminders of where I came from and why it matters. Jenna and I speak occasionally now, our conversations carefully neutral. Northridge Textiles still exists, smaller than before, but finding its way under new management. She stepped down as CEO last year, though she remains on the board. We don't discuss business. Some wounds heal, but leave scars that change how we move through the world. Last month, I attended the annual industry trade show in Chicago, my first since starting over. The convention center hummed with activity, booths displaying the latest innovations alongside traditional offerings. I walked the floor without hurry, greeting old acquaintances, examining new products, feeling neither out of place nor particularly remarkable. Just another vendor in a sea of commerce. At lunch, I found myself sharing a table with a young woman who had recently launched her own design studio. She asked thoughtful questions about supply chains and minimum orders, her notebook filling with my answers. When she learned my name, her eyes widened slightly. Northridge? Are you connected to Northridge Textiles? I smiled, neither claiming nor denying the association. I run Northridge Supply now. Different company, similar principles. She nodded, then asked the question that still catches me off guard. Do you miss the old company? It was much larger, wasn't it? I considered my answer carefully, watching the crowd move through the convention hall. Designers and buyers, suppliers and competitors, all connected in the complex web of commerce that had been my life's work. I never left what mattered, I said finally. Just the building. Later that afternoon, I passed Northridge Textiles' booth, smaller than in previous years, but still prominently positioned near the main entrance. I hadn't planned to stop, had told myself I would walk by with the same professional detachment I showed to other competitors. But something caught my eye, a familiar face behind the counter. Teresa Miller, who had been our receptionist for 15 years, whose desk had been directly outside my office. She saw me at the same moment, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to genuine warmth. Before I could decide whether to approach or retreat, she was around the counter, arms outstretched. Mr. Northridge, she said, enveloping me in a hug that smelled of the same perfume she'd worn for as long as I'd known her, something floral and understated. We've missed you. The simple sincerity in her voice undid something in me, some last knot of resentment I hadn't realized I was still carrying. We talked briefly, circumspectly. She was too loyal to share company troubles, I too proud to ask. But in the gentle pressure of her hand on my arm as we parted, in the whispered, "You look well," I felt the echoes of the company I had built, the culture of care that had defined us. Walking away, I felt lighter somehow, as if I had finally put down a burden I hadn't known I was carrying. That evening, back in my hotel room, I found myself sketching ideas for new product lines, new partnerships, possibilities I hadn't allowed myself to consider in the careful rebuilding of the past 2 years. Not expansion for its own sake, but growth with purpose. The next chapter, not just for survival, but for legacy. The greenhouse remains my sanctuary, the place where I begin and end each day. This morning, as dawn broke over the eastern hills, I stood among my plants with soil under my fingernails and dew dampening my sleeves. The world was quiet except for birdsong and the distant hum of early traffic. At 54, I feel neither young nor old, neither bitter nor particularly wise. Just present, attentive to the work before me. Later, I will drive to the warehouse and spend the day making decisions that affect people's livelihoods. I will sign contracts and approve shipments, solve problems and plan for contingencies. But for now, I tend to growing things, understanding what my father tried to teach me so long ago, that attention is its own form of love, that patient care yields results that shortcuts cannot. The business of textiles has been my life's work, but it has never been my life's meaning. That meaning lives in relationships built and maintained, in trust earned and honored, in the quiet satisfaction of doing work that matters with people who matter. My sister taught me a painful lesson about ambition and loyalty, about the true value of what we build together. But in losing what I thought was everything, I found what remained, the essential core of who I am beyond titles and accomplishments. And that, it turns out, is enough. More than enough. It is, in fact, everything. Yesterday, a package arrived at my door. No return address, just my name in an unfamiliar hand. Inside was a book bound in fabric. Not just any fabric, but the first custom we had commissioned when Northridge Textiles began to specialize in designer collaborations. A subtle herringbone in shades of blue and gray, inspired by the view from my father's office window. I recognized it immediately, ran my fingers over the texture that had once represented our company's evolution from wholesale to bespoke. Inside the book were photographs, 25 years of company picnics and holiday parties, product launches, and client dinners. Staff birthdays celebrated with supermarket cake in the break room. The ribbon cutting when we expanded the warehouse. My father's retirement party, his hand on my shoulder as he passed the symbolic keys to the kingdom. and tucked within the final pages, a handwritten note on company letterhead. Some legacies can't be measured in dollars. Thank you for building something that survived even its own reinvention. It was signed by a dozen employees, some still at Northridge Textiles, others now at Northridge Supply, a few who had moved on to different companies entirely. I sat with the book open in my lap until the light faded from the sky, tracing the faces that had been part of my journey, feeling the weight of years and choices and unexpected outcomes. This morning, that book sits on my desk at the warehouse, not as a monument to the past, but as a reminder that what we build outlasts us in ways we cannot predict or control. That legacy is not a straight line, but a tapestry of interconnected threads, stronger together than they could ever be alone. In my greenhouse, among the living things that grow according to their nature rather than my plans, I have found a different kind of success, one measured not in acquisitions or expansion, but in cultivation and patience. The tomato plants bend heavy with fruit. The herbs release their fragrance when my hand brushes their leaves. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is lost. Everything transforms, given enough time and attention. I water the seedlings, check the soil moisture, adjust the ventilation. Later, I will harvest what is ripe and plant what is ready. The cycle continues, indifferent to balance sheets and bottom lines. In this steady rhythm of care and growth, I have found the truest measure of value. Not what something is worth to others, but what it costs you to nurture it, and what that nurturing gives back to your soul.